The wagon train rolled into Centralia, Kansas on a dust-choked afternoon in late May of 1873, and Dylan Hart noticed her immediately because she was the only person not making a sound. While other women called out to their children, while men shouted orders about where to position the wagons, while horses whinnied and cattle lowed, she stood perfectly still beside a weathered prairie schooner, her lips moving without producing any noise that carried beyond her own breath. Dylan had been checking the newly arrived settlers for the territorial marshal, a routine task that usually bored him to tears, but something about the young woman made him pause. She was perhaps 20 years old, with dark blonde hair pulled back in a simple bun, wearing a gray traveling dress that had seen better days. Her face was pretty in an unassuming way, with soft features and eyes the color of fresh honey. But it was her silence that captivated him, the way she seemed to exist in her own quiet world while chaos swirled around her. An older woman, severe-looking with iron-gray hair and a mouth like a knife slash, stood beside the silent young woman. The older woman was speaking to a portly man who appeared to be the wagon master, gesturing emphatically, while the young woman kept her gaze fixed on the ground. Dylan adjusted his hat and walked over, his boots crunching in the dry Kansas dirt. Up close, he could see the young woman was trembling slightly, her hands clasped so tightly together that her knuckles had gone white. "Afternoon," Dylan said, touching the brim of his hat. "Dylan Hart, Deputy Marshal. Just need to get names for the registry." The older woman turned to him with a sharp expression. "Mrs. Edith Grayson, this is my niece, Louisa Gaines. We have come from Ohio to settle here." Dylan looked at Louisa, who had lifted her eyes briefly to meet his before dropping them again. Her lips moved and he leaned closer to hear. "Hello," she whispered, so softly he almost missed it entirely. "Speak up, girl," Mrs. Grayson snapped. "How many times must I tell you?" Louisa's face flushed crimson and she ducked her head lower. Dylan felt an unexpected surge of protectiveness toward this stranger. "I heard her just fine," he said, keeping his voice mild but firm. "Welcome to Centralia, Miss Gaines." Mrs. Grayson sniffed disapprovingly. "She has always been this way, a trial and a burden, but perhaps here she can make herself useful without disturbing anyone with her peculiarities." Dylan wanted to tell the old woman exactly what he thought of her, but he bit his tongue. Instead, he looked at Louisa again, wishing she would meet his eyes. "Will you be staying in town or heading out to claim land?" It was Mrs. Grayson who answered. "We have rooms arranged at the boarding house." "Louisa will be married within the month. Her intended is a farmer named Samuel Winters. He sent for her specifically." Something twisted in Dylan's chest at those words. Married. Of course she was spoken for. A young woman did not travel all this way without some arrangement in place. Louisa's hands tightened even more, if that was possible. Dylan noticed a slight shake of her head, so subtle he wondered if he had imagined it. "Well," he said slowly, "I hope everything works out as planned. If you need anything while you are getting settled, the marshal's office is just down the main street, past the general store." "We will not need assistance," Mrs. Grayson said crisply. She took Louisa's elbow and steered her away toward the boarding house. Dylan watched them go, troubled by something he could not quite name. The rest of the wagon train needed processing, so he forced himself to focus on his duties, but his mind kept drifting back to the whisper-voiced young woman and the way she had seemed to shrink into herself. Over the next week, Dylan found himself watching for Louisa whenever he walked through town. He saw her occasionally, always in the company of her aunt, always silent. She kept her eyes down and moved through Centralia like a ghost, barely making an impression on the physical world around her. It was not his business, Dylan told himself repeatedly. She was engaged to be married. He had no right to interfere or even to think about her as much as he did. But something about her vulnerability called to him, made him want to stand between her and whatever forces were trying to diminish her into nothing. 10 days after her arrival, Dylan was breaking up a fight outside the saloon when he heard a commotion near the church. Two men were arguing loudly and a small crowd had gathered. Dylan headed over, ready to intervene if necessary, and his heart dropped when he saw Louisa standing between the two men, her face pale and frightened. One of the men was middle-aged, rough-looking, with a mean set to his jaw. The other was the Reverend Patterson, who ran the church and served as one of Centralia's most respected citizens. She agreed to it. The rough-looking man was shouting. Her aunt made all the arrangements. I paid good money for her passage out here. Marriage is a sacred covenant, Reverend Patterson said firmly. Not a business transaction. If the young lady does not wish to marry you, Mr. Winters, then she should not be forced. Samuel Winters. This was Louisa's intended, and he looked nothing like what Dylan had imagined. He had pictured someone decent, someone worthy of her. This man looked like he would grind Louisa down to dust within a year. She does not get a say, Winters spat. Her aunt has guardianship. The girl is defective anyway, cannot even speak proper. I am doing her a favor by taking her on. Dylan was moving before he consciously decided to act. He stepped between Winters and Louisa, putting himself directly in the other man's space. Back up, Dylan said quietly. Right now. Winters looked him up and down, taking in the deputy's badge pinned to Dylan's vest. This is not your concern, lawman. This is a private matter. You are disturbing the peace and harassing this young lady. That makes it my concern. Dylan did not raise his voice, but something in his tone made Winters take a step backward. Her aunt can speak for herself if she has something to say. Where is Mrs. Grayson? Louisa's whisper came from behind him, so soft he had to strain to hear. At the boarding house. I came to the church to pray. Dylan half turned so he could see her. Did you agree to meet Mr. Winters here? She shook her head, her eyes wide and frightened. There, Dylan said, looking back at Winters. The lady did not invite your company. I suggest you move along until proper arrangements can be made through her guardian. This is not over, Winters growled. But he turned and stalked away, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust. The crowd dispersed, disappointed that there had been no real violence to entertain them. Reverend Patterson touched Dylan's shoulder briefly. Thank you, deputy. That was well handled. He smiled kindly at Louisa. Miss Gaines, you are welcome in the church any time. It is meant to be a sanctuary. After the Reverend left, Dylan found himself alone with Louisa on the church steps. She was still trembling, her breath coming quick and shallow. Are you all right? Dylan asked gently. She nodded, but tears were forming in her eyes. Her lips moved and he leaned in to hear. I do not want to marry him, she whispered. But my aunt says I have no choice. She says I am 20 years old and a burden, that no one else would want me. Anger flared hot in Dylan's chest. Your aunt is wrong. Louisa looked up at him then, really looked at him, and something passed between them. Dylan felt it like a physical force, a recognition that went beyond words. Can you? She paused, swallowed hard, tried again. Can you help me? And there it was. The moment Dylan's life changed direction. He should have directed her to a lawyer, or to the territorial court, or to any number of official channels. Instead, he heard himself say, yes. The situation was more complicated than Dylan had initially understood. Over the next few days, as he quietly investigated Louisa's circumstances, he learned that Mrs. Grayson was not actually her aunt by blood. Louisa's parents had died of cholera when she was 16, and Mrs. Grayson had been a neighbor in Ohio who took her in. But took her in meant something different than Dylan had assumed. Mrs. Grayson had essentially used Louisa as unpaid labor for 4 years, and when Samuel Winters had advertised for a wife, Mrs. Grayson had sold her off like property. It was not uncommon. Dylan had seen similar situations before. Young women without family or means were vulnerable, and there were always people willing to take advantage of that vulnerability. What made this different was that he cared. He cared about Louisa specifically, about her whisper-soft voice and her frightened eyes, and the way she seemed to be searching for something she had lost. The problem was that legally, Mrs. Grayson did have guardianship papers, signed by a judge in Ohio. Until Louisa turned 21 or married, she was under Mrs. Grayson's authority. And Mrs. Grayson was determined to see her married to Samuel Winters, who had apparently paid quite a sum for the privilege. Dylan was sitting in the marshal's office, staring at the legal documents he had obtained when the solution came to him. It was so simple and so complicated all at once that he actually laughed out loud. Marshal Tom Brennan looked up from his desk. "Something funny, maybe," Dylan said. "Or maybe I am about to do the stupidest thing I have ever done." Tom raised an eyebrow. He was in his 50s, weathered and wise, and he had been marshal of Centralia for nearly a decade. This about that quiet girl who came in on the wagon train. Dylan should not have been surprised that Tom had noticed his interest. The marshal noticed everything. "She needs help," Dylan said, "and you have decided you are the one to provide it." Tom leaned back in his chair, studying Dylan. "You know her aunt has legal guardianship. Until Louisa marries." Tom was quiet for a moment, understanding dawning on his face. "Dylan, I know it sounds crazy, but the alternative is watching her get handed over to Samuel Winters and that man." Dylan shook his head. "He will break her. So you think you should marry her instead? You have known her for less than 2 weeks. "I am not proposing a real marriage," Dylan said, though even as he spoke the words, they felt like a lie. "Just a legal one, to get her away from Mrs. Grayson and Winters. After that, she can decide what she wants to do. If she wants an annulment, we can arrange it." Tom sighed. "You are 26 years old. You have your whole life ahead of you. This kind of decision is mine to make," Dylan finished. "I know what I am doing." That was not entirely true, but Dylan had never been more certain of anything in his life. The thought of Louisa married to Samuel Winters made him physically ill. The thought of Louisa married to him, on the other hand, felt right in a way he could not fully explain. The hard part was convincing Louisa herself. He found her the next morning, sitting on a bench outside the general store while Mrs. Grayson was inside shopping. She looked up as he approached, and something like hope flickered across her face before she suppressed it. Dylan sat down beside her, making sure to leave a respectable distance between them. "I have been thinking about your situation." She waited, her hands folded in her lap. "There is a way out of the marriage to Winters," Dylan continued, "but it requires you to trust me, and it might seem crazy." "What is it?" Her whisper was so quiet he had to watch her lips to be sure she had spoken. "Marry me instead." Her eyes went wide. For a moment she just stared at him, and Dylan rushed to explain. "I know we do not know each other well, but I promise you I am not like Winters. This would be a legal marriage to get you away from your aunt's control, but it does not have to be a real marriage. We can live separately if you want. You would be free to make your own choices." "Why would you do this?" she whispered. Dylan met her gaze. "Because everyone deserves the chance to have a voice, and I think you have been silenced long enough." A tear slid down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly, glancing toward the store to make sure her aunt was not coming out. "She will never agree." "She does not have to." In Kansas, a woman who is 18 or older can marry without permission. The guardianship papers do not override that. Louisa was quiet for a long moment. Dylan could practically see her thinking, weighing her options. Finally, she whispered, "When? Today, if you want." Reverend Patterson said he would perform the ceremony. "You already asked him." I asked if he would marry a couple on short notice in cases where there were extenuating circumstances. He said yes. Another tear fell. Then another. But when Louisa looked at him again, there was something new in her expression. Determination. "Yes," she whispered. "I will marry you." The wedding took place at 3 o'clock that afternoon in the small church on the edge of town. Reverend Patterson stood before them, his Bible open, while Marshal Brennan and the Reverend's wife served as witnesses. Louisa wore the same gray traveling dress she had arrived in, though she had pinned a small wildflower to her collar. Dylan wore his best shirt and vest, his hair slicked back, his heart pounding so hard he thought everyone must be able to hear it. Mrs. Grayson and Samuel Winters had no idea what was happening. Dylan had made sure of that. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Patterson began, and Dylan felt the weight of what he was doing settle over him. This was real. This was permanent, at least legally. He was marrying a woman he barely knew to save her from a worse fate. But when he looked at Louisa and saw the gratitude and trust in her eyes, he knew he had made the right choice. The ceremony was brief. When it came time for Louisa to say her vows, she whispered them so softly that Reverend Patterson had to lean in close to hear. But Dylan heard every word, and they settled into his heart like a promise. "I, Louisa Gaines, take you, Dylan Hart, to be my lawfully wedded husband." Then it was his turn. "I, Dylan Hart, take you, Louisa Gaines, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to protect you, to respect your choices, and to help you find your voice, however long that takes." That last part was not in the traditional vows, but Reverend Patterson did not object. He blessed them, declared them man and wife, and just like that, it was done. Louisa was now Louisa Hart. The explosion came an hour later. Mrs. Grayson appeared at the marshal's office like an avenging fury, Samuel Winters right behind her. Dylan was ready for them. "You had no right," Mrs. Grayson shrieked. "That girl is my ward." "That woman is my wife," Dylan corrected, his voice calm. "And she is 20 years old, which means she had every right to choose her own husband. I had an agreement with Mr. Winters, an agreement that Louisa never consented to. She is not property to be sold." Winters stepped forward, his face mottled with rage. "I paid for her passage. I am owed compensation." "Take it up with Mrs. Grayson," Dylan said. "That was your agreement with her, not with Louisa." "This is not over," Winters snarled. "I will sue for breach of contract. Go ahead." "You will lose." Dylan stood up from his desk, using his height to his advantage. "Now get out of this office before I arrest you both for disturbing the peace." Mrs. Grayson opened her mouth to continue arguing, but Marshal Brennan stepped forward. "You heard the deputy. This marriage is legal." The young lady made her choice. You need to accept it and move on. It took several more minutes of shouting and threats before Mrs. Grayson and Winters finally left. Dylan sank back into his chair, suddenly exhausted. "Well," Tom said dryly, "that could have gone worse." "Where is Louisa?" Dylan asked. "At my house with my wife. We figured she would be safer there until things settled down." Dylan nodded gratefully. He had been worried about leaving Louisa alone, but he had needed to be here to face Mrs. Grayson. That night, Dylan sat with Louisa in the small room he rented above the saddle shop. It was not much, just a bed, a chair, a washstand, and a small table, but it was clean and private. Louisa sat in the chair while Dylan stood by the window, both of them carefully maintaining distance. "I will sleep on the floor," Dylan said. "I want you to understand that this marriage does not obligate you to anything you do not want. We are married on paper, but that is all unless you decide otherwise." Louisa looked at him with those honey-colored eyes. "You are a good man," she whispered. I did not know there were men like you." Dylan felt his chest tighten. "Tell me about your voice. Why do you speak so softly?" She looked down at her hands. For a long moment he thought she would not answer. Then, so quietly he had to cross the room to hear her, she began to speak. "When I was a child, I spoke normally. But my mother was very ill and I was told constantly to be quiet, not to disturb her. Then after my parents died, Mrs. Grayson said my voice was unpleasant, that I should speak less. Speak softer. Eventually, this was all I could manage." She touched her throat. "Sometimes I think I have forgotten how to be loud." "Maybe," Dylan said gently, "you can find your voice again. You are safe now. You can be as loud as you want." She looked up at him and he saw hope mixed with fear. "Maybe I can find my voice," she whispered. "But I do not know how." "We will figure it out together," Dylan promised. The first few weeks of their marriage were strange and careful. They lived in the small room above the saddle shop, maintaining a respectful distance. Dylan kept his promise and slept on the floor with just a bedroll for comfort, though Louisa protested that it was not necessary. During the day, he worked as deputy marshal while Louisa slowly began to explore what it meant to have freedom. She started spending time at the general store, helping the owner, Mrs. Chen, sort inventory. Mrs. Chen was a kind woman who did not mind that Louisa spoke in whispers. Then Louisa began visiting the schoolhouse, where the teacher, Miss Foster, welcomed her assistants with the younger children. Louisa had a gentle way with kids, and they did not seem bothered by her quiet voice. They just leaned in closer to hear her. Dylan watched her blossom slowly, like a flower that had been kept in darkness finally reaching toward the sun. She smiled more. She started expressing opinions, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. Her voice was still barely audible, but what she said carried weight. They talked in the evenings, sitting together at the small table, sharing meals and stories. Dylan learned that Louisa loved reading, but had not been allowed to do much of it under Mrs. Grayson's roof. He began bringing her books from the small lending library the Reverend's wife kept. Louisa devoured them, and soon they were discussing stories and ideas late into the night. Dylan learned that she was funny, that she had a sharp wit hidden beneath her quiet exterior. He learned that she was brave, that choosing to marry him had taken more courage than he had initially understood. He learned that she loved thunderstorms and hated the taste of coffee and could sketch beautiful drawings with just a pencil and scrap paper. And somewhere in those evening conversations, somewhere between sharing meals and stolen glances, Dylan fell in love with his wife. It was not the wild, desperate love of dime novels. It was quieter than that, steadier. It was the way his heart lifted every time he came home and found her reading by the window. It was the way she saved the best parts of dinner for him. It was the way she listened when he talked about his work, really listened, and offered insights that helped him see situations differently. But he did not tell her. He had promised her a marriage of convenience, a way out of an impossible situation. He would not trap her with his feelings. What Dylan did not know was that Louisa was falling too. She had never imagined a man like Dylan could exist. He was unfailingly kind, patient with her silences, interested in her thoughts. He never raised his voice in anger, never tried to control her movements, never made her feel small. Around him, she felt safe in a way she had not since her parents died. More than that, she felt seen. Dylan looked at her like she mattered, like her whispered words carried the same weight as anyone else's. He encouraged her to try new things, to explore Centralia, to figure out who she wanted to be now that she was free. And slowly, Louisa began to discover herself. She found she enjoyed helping at the general store, like the orderly work of organizing inventory. She loved working with the children at the school, seeing their faces light up when they learned something new. She started sketching more seriously, capturing scenes from Centralia on paper. She also found herself noticing things about Dylan. The way he moved, confident and easy. The way he was unfailingly polite to everyone, even people who did not deserve it. The way his face softened when he looked at her. The way her heart beat faster when he came home each evening. Louisa had never been in love before. She did not have anything to compare this feeling to. But she thought this might be it, this warm ache in her chest, this constant awareness of Dylan's presence, this longing for more than the careful distance they maintained. 2 months after their wedding, everything changed. It was a Saturday evening, and Dylan had just come home from a long day dealing with a dispute between two ranchers. He looked tired and frustrated, and without thinking, Louisa crossed the room and touched his arm. "Are you all right?" she whispered. Dylan looked down at her hand on his arm, then up at her face. Something in his expression shifted. "Louisa, I need to tell you something." Her heart started pounding. "What is it?" "I know I promised you that this marriage did not have to be real, that you would be free to make your own choices. And I stand by that promise, but I need you to know." He paused, took a breath. "I have fallen in love with you." Louisa stopped breathing. She just stared at him, his words echoing in her mind. "I do not expect anything from you," Dylan continued quickly. "I just could not keep pretending I did not feel this way. If you want to maintain our current arrangement, that is fine. If you want an annulment and your freedom, I will arrange it. But I needed to be honest with you." Louisa tried to speak, but no sound came out. Frustration welled up inside her. This was the most important moment of her life, and she could not even say what she felt. She tried again, forcing air through her vocal cords, but only the faintest whisper emerged. "I." She stopped, tears of frustration gathering in her eyes. "I cannot." "It is all right," Dylan said gently. "You do not have to say anything." But she did. She had to. This was too important to let her voice fail her now. Louisa closed her eyes, thought about everything that had happened, everything she had learned about herself in these 2 months. She thought about how Dylan had given her safety and freedom and respect. She thought about how she had found strength she did not know she possessed. She thought about the little girl she had been before her mother got sick, the girl who had laughed and played and spoken without fear. "Maybe I can find my voice," she had whispered to Dylan on their wedding day. Maybe she could. Maybe now was the moment to try. Louisa opened her eyes, looked directly at Dylan, and spoke. Not in a whisper, not in a breath that barely carried, but in a real voice that filled the room. "I love you too." The words came out hoarse and cracked, unpracticed from years of disuse, but they were there. They were real, they were loud enough to hear. Dylan's eyes went wide. "Louisa." "I love you," she said again, and this time her voice was stronger. Tears were streaming down her face, but she was smiling. "I love you, Dylan Hart." He crossed the distance between them in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms. Louisa buried her face against his chest, feeling his heart pound beneath her cheek. His arms were strong and warm around her, and she felt safer than she ever had in her life. "Say it again," Dylan whispered against her hair. "I love you," Louisa said, her voice still rough but clear. "I love you, I love you, I love you." Dylan pulled back just enough to cup her face in his hands. His eyes were bright with emotion. "Can I kiss you?" "Yes," Louisa said, and the word was strong and sure. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, a question and an answer all at once. Then it deepened, and Louisa felt something inside her break open. All the years of being silenced, of being told she was too much or not enough, of being made to feel invisible fell away. In Dylan's arms she was real, she was seen, she was loved. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Dylan was grinning like a fool. "Your voice," he said. "Louisa, your voice. I know." She touched her throat wonderingly. "I did not think I could anymore." What changed? Louisa thought about it. You, she said simply. You made me feel safe enough to try. That night, they talked for hours, sitting close together on the bed, no longer maintaining the careful distance that had marked their marriage until now. Louisa used her new voice tentatively, still unused to the sound of it, but growing more confident with each word. They talked about their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. Dylan told her about growing up in Missouri, about how his father had died in the war and his mother had remarried a man who did not want a reminder of her first husband around. He had left home at 17 and drifted west, eventually ending up in Centralia and finding his calling as a lawman. Louisa told him about her parents, about the happy childhood that had been cut short by cholera and grief. She told him about the years with Mrs. Grayson, about feeling like a ghost in her own life. She told him about the moment in the church when he had stood between her and Samuel Winters, how that had been the first time she had felt protected in years. I want this to be a real marriage, Louisa said as the sky outside began to lighten with dawn. If you do. There is nothing I want more, Dylan said and kissed her again. Their marriage changed after that night, deepened into something rich and true. They moved to a larger room above the general store, 2 rooms instead of 1, giving them more space. Dylan taught Louisa to shoot a pistol, insisting that she should be able to protect herself. Louisa taught Dylan to sketch, laughing at his clumsy attempts to capture the prairie landscape. They went on long walks in the evenings, out beyond the edge of town where the Kansas grassland stretched endlessly under vast skies. Louisa practiced using her voice, sometimes just speaking random words, sometimes singing snatches of songs she remembered from childhood. Her voice grew stronger each day, though it never became truly loud. She spoke in a normal tone now, clear and audible, but there was still a softness to it that was distinctly hers. I do not think I will ever be someone who shouts, she told Dylan one evening as they watched the sunset paint the sky gold and crimson. I do not need you to shout, Dylan said, pulling her close. I just need you to be able to tell me what you are thinking and feeling. The volume does not matter. Louisa rested her head on his shoulder. I am thinking that I am happy and I am feeling grateful. For what? For you, for this, for getting a second chance at life. Dylan kissed the top of her head. I am the grateful one. You have made me happier than I knew was possible. Life in Centralia settled into a comfortable rhythm. Dylan continued his work as deputy marshal, handling the usual disputes and disturbances of a growing town. Louisa continued helping at the general store and the school, and she began selling her sketches to travelers passing through town. Her drawings of prairie life, simple but evocative, became quite popular. Mrs. Grayson and Samuel Winters had both left Centralia in the weeks following Dylan and Louisa's marriage, much to everyone's relief. Dylan heard through the marshal's network that Winters had been arrested in Missouri for attempting to buy another mail-order bride through fraudulent means. Mrs. Grayson had apparently returned to Ohio, alone and bitter. Louisa felt nothing but relief at their departure. She had no desire for revenge or even reconciliation. She simply wanted to move forward with her new life. That new life brought unexpected challenges. In October, 5 months after their marriage, Louisa fainted while helping Mrs. Chen at the general store. Dr. Matthews, Centralia's physician, examined her and delivered news that left both Dylan and Louisa stunned. You are with child, he said with a gentle smile. About 3 months along, I would say. Congratulations. Dylan looked like he might faint himself. Louisa felt joy and terror in equal measure. A baby. They were going to have a baby. Is she all right? Dylan asked, his voice tight with concern. Is the baby all right? Both mother and child seem perfectly healthy. Dr. Matthews assured him. Just make sure she gets plenty of rest and good food. Come see me once a month so I can check on the baby's development. After the doctor left, Dylan and Louisa sat together in their rooms, holding hands, trying to absorb this life-changing news. "Are you happy?" Louisa asked softly. Dylan turned to her with such love in his eyes that it took her breath away. "I am terrified and thrilled all at once. A baby, Louisa." "Our baby." "I do not know how to be a mother," Louisa admitted. "My own mother was wonderful, but she got sick when I was so young. I do not remember many of her lessons." "We will figure it out together," Dylan said, echoing the words he had spoken to her months ago about finding her voice. "Just like we figure everything else out." Louisa's pregnancy progressed smoothly through the winter. Her belly grew round, and Dylan treated her like she was made of glass, constantly worrying and fussing until Louisa had to firmly tell him that she was not fragile. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time," she reminded him, her voice clear and strong. "I will be fine." But Dylan could not help worrying. Louisa had become the center of his world, and the thought of anything happening to her or their child filled him with dread. He started working shorter hours, wanting to be home with her as much as possible. Marshal Brennan understood and was accommodating, having been through several pregnancies with his own wife. The people of Centralia rallied around them. Mrs. Chen gave Louisa bolts of soft fabric for baby clothes. Miss Foster organized the other women to prepare meals that could be stored for after the birth. Even Reverend Patterson and his wife stopped by regularly to check on them and offer support. Louisa was touched by the kindness. She had lived so long feeling invisible and unwanted that this outpouring of community care made her cry more than once. "People are good," she told Dylan one evening as she sewed tiny gowns for their coming child. "I had forgotten that." "Not all people," Dylan said, thinking of Mrs. Grayson and Samuel Winters. "But enough people. The world has both kinds." "I am glad our child will grow up surrounded by the good kind," Louisa said. Their son was born on a warm May evening in 1874, almost exactly a year after Louisa had arrived in Centralia. The labor was long and difficult, and Dylan paced outside their rooms like a caged animal while Mrs. Chen and the doctor attended to Louisa. He could hear her crying out, and it took every ounce of his self-control not to burst through the door. Finally, after hours that felt like years, he heard a different cry, high and indignant and absolutely beautiful, the cry of new life. Mrs. Chen opened the door, smiling. "You have a son, and your wife is asking for you." Dylan practically ran into the room. Louisa was propped up in bed, exhausted and sweaty but radiantly beautiful, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in soft cloth. She looked up as he entered, and her smile was brighter than the sun. "Come meet your son," she said, her voice tired but full of joy. Dylan approached carefully, like he was approaching something holy. He looked down at the baby in Louisa's arms and felt his heart crack wide open. The baby was small and red and perfect, with a shock of dark hair and tiny fists that waved in the air. "Can I hold him?" Dylan asked. Louisa carefully transferred the baby to Dylan's arms. The infant was so light, so fragile, and Dylan felt fear and love surge through him in equal measure. This tiny person was his son, his and Louisa's, a whole new life they had created together. "What should we name him?" Louisa asked. They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy but had not settled on anything definite. Dylan looked down at his son, at this perfect miracle, and thought about everything that had brought them to this moment. "What about Thomas?" he suggested. "After Marshal Brennan, he has been good to us." "Thomas Hart," Louisa said, testing the name. "I like it. Tom for short." Little Tom Hart came into the world healthy and loud, with powerful lungs that he exercised regularly. Those first few months were exhausting, filled with sleepless nights and constant feedings and the steep learning curve of new parenthood. But they were also filled with joy. Dylan discovered that he loved being a father. He loved holding his son, loved watching Tom's face change from moment to moment, loved the way the baby would quiet when Dylan walked with him and sang off-key lullabies. He split his time between his marshal duties and helping Louisa at home, determined to be present for his family. Louisa found motherhood both harder and more rewarding than she had imagined. Her body was exhausted, her emotions all over the place, but when she looked at Tom, at this little person she and Dylan had made, she felt a love so fierce it almost frightened her. She would do anything to protect this child, to give him the happy childhood she had lost too early. She also found that being a mother gave her even more reason to use her voice. She sang to Tom constantly, lullabies and folk songs and made-up tunes. She talked to him about everything and nothing, narrating her day, telling him stories. Her voice grew stronger still, more confident, because her son needed to hear her. "You are amazing," Dylan told her one night as he watched her nurse Tom, her voice soft as she sang an old hymn. "I am in awe of you." Louisa smiled at him over their son's head. "We are a team. I could not do this without you." "You could," Dylan said, "but I am grateful you do not have to." As Tom grew from an infant into a chubby, curious baby, the Hart family became a fixture in Centralia. People knew them and liked them. Dylan had been promoted to full marshal after Tom Brennan retired, and he took his duties seriously, keeping the peace with fairness and compassion. Louisa continued her sketching and began teaching art to some of the older children at the school. They were building a real life together. When Tom was 18 months old, Dylan came home one day with unexpected news. "There is land available just outside of town. 5 acres with a small house. It is not much, but we could make it into something. Have space for Tom to run around. Maybe a garden." Louisa's eyes lit up. "Our own house, if you want it. We have been saving, and I think we can afford it." They walked out to see the property the next day, Tom bouncing on Dylan's shoulders. The house was small and weathered, clearly needing work, but it sat on a gentle rise with a view of the prairie stretching to the horizon. There was a barn that needed repairs, a well that still functioned, and rich soil perfect for planting. "Yes," Louisa said without hesitation. "This is ours. This is home." They bought the property and spent the next several months fixing it up. Dylan repaired the barn and reinforced the house's structure. Louisa planted a garden and sewed curtains for the windows. They painted and cleaned and slowly transformed the weathered little house into a warm, welcoming home. Tom took his first steps in the living room of that house, wobbling across the wooden floor to Dylan's outstretched arms. He said his first word, "Mama," in the garden while Louisa was weeding. They celebrated every milestone, every moment of growth, grateful for the life they were building together. 2 years after Tom's birth, Louisa found herself pregnant again. This time, there was no terror, only joy. They knew what to expect now, felt prepared in a way they had not been the first time. Their daughter was born in the winter of 1876, during a fierce snowstorm that blanketed the prairie in white. She came faster than Tom had, and Dr. Matthews barely made it in time. Dylan held Louisa's hand through the whole thing, whispering encouragement and love. "A daughter," Dr. Matthews announced, placing the squalling baby in Louisa's arms. "Healthy and strong." The baby had Louisa's blonde hair and Dylan's dark eyes, and she stared up at them with an expression of intense concentration, like she was already figuring out the world. "Laura," Louisa said immediately. "Her name is Laura." Dylan kissed his wife's forehead. "Laura Hart. Perfect." Life with 2 children was chaotic and exhausting and absolutely wonderful. Tom, now a sturdy toddler, was fascinated by his baby sister and wanted to help with everything. Dylan juggled his marshal duties with fatherhood, often bringing Tom to the office with him when Louisa needed to rest. Louisa found she could sketch while nursing Laura, her hands busy while her daughter fed. The years rolled by in a blur of happy moments. Tom started school, showing a quick mind and natural curiosity. Laura proved to be fearless, climbing everything she could reach and giving her parents heart attacks on a regular basis. They celebrated birthdays and holidays, weathered illnesses and injuries, supported each other through good times and bad. Dylan and Louisa's love only deepened with time. They still talked late into the night sometimes, sharing thoughts and dreams. They still went on walks when they could steal time away from the children. They still looked at each other like they were the answer to questions they had not known they were asking. "You ever regret it?" Dylan asked one evening when they were sitting on their porch, watching the sunset while the children played in the yard. "Marrying me that day." Louisa looked at him like he had lost his mind. "Regret it? Dylan, you saved my life." "You saved your own life," Dylan corrected. "You made the choice to marry me. You found your voice again. You built this life we have. I just helped." "We helped each other," Louisa said, taking his hand. "That is what love is it not? Helping each other become who we are meant to be." Dylan raised her hand to his lips. "You are wise, Mrs. Hart." "I am happy, Mr. Hart," Louisa said, her voice clear and strong. "I am so deeply, completely happy." Time continued its march forward. Tom grew into a thoughtful, responsible boy who loved books and wanted to be a lawyer when he grew up. Laura became a whirlwind of energy and mischief, constantly exploring and questioning everything. Dylan served as marshal of Centralia with distinction, respected by everyone in town. Louisa's artwork gained recognition beyond their small community, and a gallery in Topeka began selling her prairie scenes. They added a third child to their family when Tom was 8 and Laura was 6. Another boy, this one with Louisa's honey-colored eyes and a quiet disposition. They named him James, and he completed their family in a way that felt just right. Through it all, through the challenges and the triumphs, the exhausting days and the beautiful moments, Dylan and Louisa remained each other's anchor. They had built something remarkable together, not just a family but a partnership based on respect and trust and deep, abiding love. When Tom turned 18 in 1892, Louisa and Dylan sat on their porch and marveled at how fast the years had flown. Their eldest son was heading to university in the fall, planning to study law just as he had always wanted. Laura, at 16, was teaching at the same school where Louisa had once volunteered. James, at 10, showed signs of becoming an artist like his mother. "We did well," Dylan said, his hair now threaded with gray, lines etched around his eyes from years of smiling. "We did," Louisa agreed. Her voice had never become truly loud, but it was strong and confident, the voice of a woman who knew exactly who she was. "You remember our wedding day?" Dylan asked. "How terrified we both were." "I remember thinking you were the bravest person I had ever met," Louisa said. "Agreeing to marry a stranger to help her escape. I remember thinking you were the strongest person I had ever met, having the courage to take that chance to trust me." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the sounds of the prairie evening. Crickets chirping, a distant coyote call, the wind rustling through the grass. "I love you," Louisa said, the words as easy now as breathing. "Thank you for giving me back my voice." "I love you too," Dylan said. "Thank you for teaching me what it means to truly love someone." As the sun set over the Kansas prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange and red, Dylan Hart and Louisa Hart sat together on the porch of the home they had built, surrounded by the life they had created. It was not the life either of them had imagined when that wagon train rolled into Centralia all those years ago, but it was better than anything they could have dreamed. Years continued to pass, bringing with them the natural changes that time bestows. Tom graduated from university and returned to Centralia to set up a law practice, becoming the town's first dedicated attorney. He married a smart young woman named Catherine, a teacher from Topeka, and they settled down just a few miles from Dylan and Louisa's homestead. Laura, true to her fearless nature, married a journalist who traveled the West documenting the changing frontier. She went with him, sending letters home filled with adventures and observations. Louisa treasured each one, reading them aloud to Dylan in the evenings. James, their quiet youngest, indeed became an artist. He studied under his mother and then traveled east for formal training, returning with new techniques and perspectives that he incorporated into his prairie landscapes. His work eventually hung in galleries across the country, always signed James Hart, Centralia, Kansas. Dylan retired from his position as marshal in 1895, after more than 20 years of service. The town threw him a celebration, and speaker after speaker praised his fairness, his wisdom, and his dedication to justice. Through it all, Louisa sat in the front row, her eyes shining with pride. In retirement, Dylan and Louisa found new rhythms. They tended their garden together, the plot now expanded to include flowers alongside vegetables. They took long rides on horseback across the prairie, revisiting spots that held meaning for them. They welcomed grandchildren, 5 in total, and spoiled them with stories and sweets and unconditional love. On their 25th wedding anniversary in 1898, their children organized a party at the church where Dylan and Louisa had spoken their vows so many years ago. The whole town turned out, a testament to how beloved the Hart family had become in Centralia. Reverend Patterson, now elderly but still sharp, gave a speech about the unusual wedding he had performed a quarter-century earlier. "I married them in haste," he said, "with just 2 witnesses because they needed help. I wondered then if I was doing the right thing. But looking at them now, at the family they have built, at the love that has only grown stronger with time, I know it was one of the best decisions I ever made." Dylan and Louisa stood before their community, their hands clasped together, and renewed their vows. This time, there was nothing hasty about it. This time they spoke slowly and clearly, each word weighted with 25 years of shared history. "I, Dylan Hart, take you, Louisa Hart, to be my wife again and always. You have been my partner, my best friend, my greatest love. I promise to continue honoring you, supporting you, and loving you for all the days I have left." Louisa's voice rang out clear and strong, filling the church with sound. "I, Louisa Hart, take you, Dylan Hart, to be my husband again and always. You gave me the freedom to find my voice and the courage to use it. You have been my rock, my joy, my home. I promise to continue loving you with all that I am for all the days I have left." There was not a dry eye in the church. The party afterwards lasted well into the evening, with music and dancing and enough food to feed half of Kansas. Tom gave a toast honoring his parents and the example they had set for him and his siblings. Laura read a poem she had written about their love story. James presented them with a painting he had created specifically for the occasion, showing their homestead at sunset, peaceful and beautiful. As the sun began to set, Dylan pulled Louisa away from the crowd. They walked to the edge of town, to the spot where they used to take evening strolls when they were newly married. 25 years, Dylan marveled. It feels like yesterday and a lifetime ago all at once. "Do you remember what you said to me that day in front of the general store?" Louisa asked. "When you proposed, I said that everyone deserves the chance to have a voice, and that I thought you had been silenced long enough. You were right, Louisa said. But what you did not know then was that you were also giving yourself a voice that mattered, that made a difference. Dylan looked at her questioningly. You could have lived a quiet life, avoided complications, taken the easy path, Louisa explained. But instead, you chose to stand up for someone who needed help. You chose to be brave. And in doing so, you showed everyone what kind of man you are. The best kind. Dylan pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers. We made each other better. We did, Louisa agreed. We still do. The years that followed were peaceful ones. Dylan and Louisa settled into the comfortable rhythms of older age, their days slower but no less full. They spent time with their grandchildren, teaching them about the prairie and sharing stories of the old days. They maintained their homestead, though they took help from their children more often now. In 1902, when Louisa was 49 and Dylan was 55, they took a trip back to Ohio. It was Louisa's first time returning since she had left with Mrs. Grayson nearly 30 years before. She wanted to visit her parents' graves, to tell them about the life she had built. They found the small cemetery where her parents were buried, their headstones weathered but still standing. Louisa knelt between the graves, Dylan standing supportively behind her, and she spoke to her mother and father. I am happy, she told them, her voice steady and clear. I found love. I have 3 beautiful children and 5 grandchildren. I have a home and a life that matters. I wish you could have been part of it, but I hope you can see it somehow, wherever you are. I hope you are proud of me. Dylan helped her to her feet, and they stood together in the quiet cemetery, paying respects to the parents Louisa had lost so young. On the way back to Kansas, Louisa was more reflective than usual. I have been thinking, she said as they sat on the train, watching the landscape roll by, about how much my life changed because of one brave choice. Your choice to marry me, Dylan said. Our choice to marry each other, Louisa corrected. But yes, I think about who I would be if I had not made that choice, if I had married Samuel Winters or stayed under Mrs. Grayson's control. I probably would not have survived it, Dylan, not my spirit anyway. You are stronger than you give yourself credit for, Dylan said. You would have found a way, maybe, but I am grateful I did not have to find out. She took his hand. I am grateful that I got to find out who I could be with someone who loved me instead. Who loves you, Dylan corrected gently. Present tense, always present tense. Louisa smiled and leaned her head on his shoulder. Present tense, she agreed. They returned to Centralia, to their homestead and their family and their life. Tom's law practice was thriving, and he was making a difference in people's lives, just as his parents had. Laura and her husband had settled in Denver, where she wrote articles for the newspaper about Western life. James had married a local girl and was raising his own family while continuing his art. The Hart family was a success by any measure, but more than that, they were happy. They genuinely liked each other, enjoyed spending time together, and supported each other through difficulties. It was a legacy that Dylan and Louisa were deeply proud of. In the autumn of 1905, Centralia celebrated its 50th anniversary as an incorporated town. There was a grand celebration planned, with speeches and exhibitions and a historical display. The organizers asked Dylan and Louisa to be part of the program, sharing their story as longtime residents. Louisa was nervous about speaking in front of such a large crowd, even though her voice had been strong for decades now. Dylan held her hand as they walked to the podium that had been set up in the town square. The crowd hushed as Louisa began to speak. Her voice was not loud. It never had been, but with Dylan at her side and the community gathered before her, she found the strength to project clearly. When I came to Centralia in 1873, she began, I could barely speak above a whisper. I had been told so many times that my voice did not matter that I had almost started to believe it. But this town, and one man in particular, taught me differently. She glanced at Dylan, who smiled encouragingly. I learned that everyone has a voice, and everyone's voice matters. I learned that courage is not about being fearless, but about acting despite your fear. I learned that love is not something that happens to you, but something you choose every day through actions big and small. She paused, looking out at the faces gathered before her. Some were old friends, people she had known for decades. Others were younger folks, newcomers to Centralia. All of them were listening intently. This town gave me a home when I needed one. It gave me the space to find myself, to discover who I was meant to be, and I am grateful for that every single day. So thank you, Centralia, for being a place where a girl who spoke in whispers could learn to sing. The applause was thunderous. People stood, clapping and cheering, and Louisa felt tears stream down her face. Dylan wrapped his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, overwhelmed by emotion. After the ceremony, person after person came up to thank them for sharing their story. Young women especially sought out Louisa, telling her how inspiring she was, how her story gave them courage to speak up in their own lives. You have no idea how much good you have done, one young woman said, tears in her eyes. My husband, he sometimes makes me feel small. But hearing you talk about finding your voice, it makes me think I can stand up for myself. Louisa took the young woman's hands. You can, she said firmly. You deserve to be heard. Do not let anyone make you feel otherwise. As they walked home that evening, tired but happy, Dylan said, You were magnificent today. I was terrified, Louisa admitted. I know, but you did it anyway. That is what makes it magnificent. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the evening sounds of the prairie. Finally, Louisa said, Do you remember what you promised me on our wedding day? I promised you a lot of things. You promised to help me find my voice, however long it took. Louisa stopped walking and turned to face him. You kept that promise, Dylan, and you gave me so much more besides. You gave me a life worth living, a family worth cherishing. You gave me myself back. Dylan cupped her face gently. You did the hard work. I just stood beside you while you did it. That is all I ever needed, Louisa said. Someone to stand beside me. They continued their walk home, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful together. The years continued their steady march. Dylan and Louisa aged gracefully, their hair going white, their movements slower but their love as strong as ever. They celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary in 1913, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. The Hart family had grown large and sprawling, but at its center were still Dylan and Louisa, the foundation upon which everything else was built. In the spring of 1915, Dylan fell ill. It started as a cough that would not go away, then progressed to weakness and fatigue. Dr. Matthews, now quite elderly himself, diagnosed pneumonia and prescribed rest, but they all knew the truth. Dylan was 72 years old, and his body was simply wearing out. Louisa nursed him devotedly, rarely leaving his bedside. Their children took turns visiting, bringing the grandchildren to see him. Dylan held court from his bed, telling stories and dispensing wisdom, making sure each person knew how much they were loved. One evening, when it was just Dylan and Louisa, he said, I have no regrets. Neither do I, Louisa said, holding his hand. I am only sorry to leave you. Do not apologize for that, Louisa said firmly, though her eyes were wet with tears. You have given me 42 years of love and partnership. That is more than most people get in several lifetimes. Dylan smiled weakly. You will be all right without me. I will survive, Louisa corrected. But I will miss you every day for the rest of my life. Tell me again, Dylan whispered. Tell me the story of us. So Louisa did. She told him about the day they met, about how he had noticed her silence in a crowd of noise. She told him about their hasty wedding, about the fear and hope that had mingled together. She told him about falling in love slowly, about finding her voice, about building a life together piece by piece. She told him about their children, about watching Tom take his first steps, about Laura's fearless spirit, about James's quiet creativity. She told him about the homestead they had built, about years of sunsets watched from their porch, about a love that had only grown stronger with time. It was a good story, Dylan said when she finished. It was the best story, Louisa corrected, because it was ours. Dylan died peacefully that night with Louisa holding his hand and their children gathered around. He slipped away quietly, just as the sun was rising over the prairie he had loved so much. The funeral was attended by what seemed like the entire town of Centralia. Dylan Hart had been a fixture in the community for over 40 years, and everyone had a story about his kindness, his fairness, his dedication to justice. The church overflowed with people wanting to pay their respects. Louisa spoke at the service, her voice steady despite her grief. Dylan Hart was the best man I ever knew, she said. He saved my life when I was drowning, and then he spent the next 4 decades standing beside me, making sure I never drowned again. He taught me what love looks like in action. He showed me that strength can be gentle and that courage can be quiet. He was my partner, my best friend, my greatest love. And while my heart is broken at losing him, I am so grateful that I got to love him at all. After the funeral, after the condolences and the food and the well-meaning platitudes, Louisa found herself alone in the house she and Dylan had shared for so many years. It felt too empty, too quiet. For the first time in decades, she understood the appeal of silence, of retreating into voicelessness. But then she remembered what Dylan had told her all those years ago. Everyone deserves the chance to have a voice. She had fought too hard to find hers to give it up now, even in grief. So Louisa kept living. She spent time with her children and grandchildren. She continued her artwork, finding solace in capturing the prairie landscapes Dylan had loved. She volunteered at the school and the church. She told stories about Dylan to anyone who would listen, keeping his memory alive. It was not easy. Grief was a constant companion, a weight she carried every day. But Louisa had learned long ago how to bear heavy burdens. She survived, and more than that, she found moments of joy. In her grandchildren's laughter, in a beautiful sunset, in the memory of 42 years of love. 5 years after Dylan's death, on a warm spring day in 1920, Louisa sat on the porch of their homestead and looked out at the prairie. She was 72 years old, the same age Dylan had been when he died. She had lived a good life, a full life, a life worth living. Tom came to visit that afternoon, bringing his oldest son, Dylan, named for his grandfather. Young Dylan was 15, curious and bright, much like Tom had been at that age. "Tell me about grandfather," the boy said as they sat together on the porch. "Tell me how you and he fell in love." Louisa smiled. It was a story she never tired of telling. "It started with a whisper," she began. "I came to Centralia barely able to speak, and your grandfather gave me the courage to find my voice." She told him the whole story, from her arrival on the wagon train to their hasty wedding to the life they had built together. Young Dylan listened, fascinated, asking questions and marveling at the tale. "So you were brave," he said when she finished. "We were both brave," Louisa corrected. "That is the secret, you know. Love requires courage from both people." "I hope I find a love like that someday," young Dylan said. "I hope you do too," Louisa said, patting his hand, "and I hope you are brave enough to reach for it when it comes." After Tom and his son left, Louisa sat alone on the porch, watching the sun set. She thought about Dylan, about the life they had shared, about the legacy they had left behind. 3 children, all happy and successful, 5 grandchildren and counting. A family built on love and respect and mutual support. She thought about the girl she had been, arriving in Centralia with nothing but fear and silence. She thought about the woman she had become, strong and confident and capable of joy even in the midst of grief. "I found my voice," she whispered to the prairie wind, to Dylan's memory, to herself. "Just like you said I would." And in the fading light of that Kansas evening, Louisa Hart smiled, content in the knowledge that she had lived well and loved deeply. The story that had begun with a whisper had grown into something loud and lasting, a testament to the power of courage, love, and the simple act of choosing to speak. Louisa lived for another 8 years, remaining active and engaged with her community until the very end. She passed away peacefully in her sleep in 1928 at the age of 75, surrounded by the love of her family and the respect of her town. She was buried beside Dylan on a hillside overlooking their homestead, their names carved together on a single headstone. The Hart family continued to grow and thrive for generations, each one carrying forward the legacy of courage and love that Dylan and Louisa had established. Their story became part of Centralia's history, told and retold, an example of how 2 people could build something beautiful from the most unlikely beginning. And whenever someone in Centralia felt voiceless, whenever they felt small or invisible or silenced, someone would inevitably tell them about Louisa Hart, the bride who spoke in whispers and found her voice through love and courage. It became a story of hope, a reminder that it is never too late to speak up, to be brave, to reach for the life you deserve. The homestead remained in the Hart family for decades, a landmark and a memory. The porch where Dylan and Louisa had sat countless evenings still stood, weathered but sturdy. The garden Louisa had planted still bloomed each spring. The barn Dylan had rebuilt still sheltered animals and hay. And on quiet evenings when the wind blew across the Kansas prairie, some said you could almost hear it, a whisper that grew into something stronger, a voice that refused to be silenced, a love that transcended even death itself. Dylan and Louisa Hart had built a life together that mattered, not because it was extraordinary in the grand scheme of things, but because it was filled with small, daily acts of love and courage. They had shown their children, their grandchildren, and their community what it meant to stand beside someone, to help them become who they were meant to be, to choose love even when it was difficult. Their story, which began with a cowboy noticing a young woman who spoke only in whispers, ended with a family legacy that would last for generations. It was a simple story in many ways, but it was also a powerful one. Because at its heart was a truth that transcended time and place, that everyone deserves to have a voice, and sometimes all it takes is one person believing in you to help you find it. The years rolled on, the world changed, but the story of Dylan and Louisa Hart remained, a testament to love, courage, and the transformative power of believing that everyone, even a bride who speaks in whispers, has something important to say. And so their story ends, not with silence, but with the echoing voices of generations who learned from their example that love is not just about grand gestures, but about the quiet, steady choice to stand beside someone, day after day, helping them find their strength, their voice, their truest self. Dylan and Louisa Hart built a love that lasted, a family that thrived, and a legacy that endured long after they were gone. It was a love story for the ages, born in the wild Kansas prairie, nurtured through challenges and triumphs, and remembered with reverence by all who knew them. They had lived fully, loved deeply, and in the end, that was everything that mattered.